This podcast is brought to you by the Albany Public Library main branch and the generosity of listeners like you. What is a podcast? God, Daddy, these people talk as much as you do. Razib Khan's Unsupervised Learning.
Thanks for listening to the ungated version of the Unsupervised Learning podcast. If you want to read some essays on some of these topics, please check out razib.substack.com. Again, that's razib.substack.com. Thank you.
Hey everybody, this is Razib Khan with the Unsupervised Learning Podcast. And today I am here with Laura Spinney, who is a science writer who is based out of Paris, I believe. And you, Laura, you are most well known for the 2017 book, Pale Rider, which is about the influenza pandemic. But today we are here to talk about your recently published book, Proto, How One Ancient Language Went Global. Can you tell us which ancient language this was and just why you started writing this book?
Yeah, sure. So the language in question is proto-Indo-European, which is the name we give to the last common ancestor of all the Indo-European languages, and that essentially is the largest family of languages on Earth, including English, Hindi, Spanish, Russian, amongst those that are still living. There are about 450 languages altogether still alive today in that family, and altogether they're spoken by nearly half of humanity as a first language, so it's enormous.
Yeah, obviously we are speaking a language that is also descended from proto-Indo-Europeans, so I guess it's close to our close to our mouths, or close to our tongues or larynxes or something
Close
like
to
that,
our
right?
hearts. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. As you indicated, it's like quite a diverse array of languages that are, proto or descended from proto-Indo-European that are Indo-European, and we'll get into the details uh, uh, of how that happened. Why is this, your book is a pretty thorough narrative, I think, of what we know, like as of when we're talking, because as you know, there's a lot of changes that are occurring rapidly or were occurring rapidly I assume while you were even writing the book, while it was even being
Yeah,
conceived, right?
absolutely. Yeah, and ongoing for sure.
And so why did you want to start writing the book now?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question because it's, this mystery of where these languages came from and where and who and why and when Proto-Indo-European was spoken has been, exercising people for a couple of hundred years. Um, so why write it now? Well, I suppose essentially the short answer is because of paleogenetics, because of ancient DNA, because the ability to extract DNA from ancient human remains and to analyze it has meant that geneticists can, for the first time with any precision, trace prehistoric people, that is, people who lived before writing, across time and space. And it's very important to mention the sort of driving principle of this whole exercise up front, I think, which is that even today, but even more so in prehistory, the thinking is that migration was the main driver of language change. So, especially at a time when there was no writing, when there were no schools, when there was no literacy and no national boundaries, so no national languages, the way that languages were changed was because people carried them across space. And so dialects got separated from each other, and the ones that traveled came into contact with new languages and dialects and were changed by them, and in turn changed them. And that's how linguistic landscapes came to be reconfigured.
Yeah. Jumping back from linguistics a little bit and talking about some of the principles, you have a part in there. This is not just obviously it's not going to be just a dry recitation of the papers or whatnot. There are some characters, there's some individuals in there. Why don't you describe your sense of the primary players in paleogenetics? I think some of the listeners of this Substack will be pretty familiar, or this podcast will be pretty familiar with them as names, maybe as people who write the papers, but they don't know them as fully fleshed out human beings. And I think that you had some interesting descriptions. You clearly got to know them a little bit. I've met David Reich and Nick Patterson. I don't know Askia very well, but know him by reputation, which is not.
Sorry,
Uh,
who don't you know?
S.K. Willerslev.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is.
Okay.
Yeah. So just talk about like these main players, because paleogenetics does play, I would say, it does play a catalytic role in your book, right?
Absolutely. It's given a huge new impetus to the story. I mean, some might say it hasn't changed the broad outlines. I think I would probably quibble with that. And as you mentioned, it's still changing, but I think it really has changed and brought a whole a new wealth of detail into the story as well. So yeah, and the other thing to say is that in my book, I kind of include portraits of those people, those scientists, and in the other fields that are concerned as well, archaeology and linguistics. I also try and create portraits of the ancient people who we're talking about, whose languages we're discussing, and I felt it was important, an important aspect of the story, essentially because language is so political, language is so tied up with identity, and people even today don't even agree necessarily on the definition of a language and what how to carve out the space between dialects and languages and so on. And therefore, I think it's important to talk about who is doing this work, who they are, where they're coming from, and so on. That's probably true of all science, to be frank, but particularly in this case. And so when it comes to the genetics sort of third of the story, um, I guess there are three main powerhouses in the world, at least from the perspective of this story, and that would be David Reich's lab at Harvard, the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig, and Eske Willerslav's lab in Copenhagen, which, as you say, I'm sure your listeners are all really, really familiar with.
And so, just you know, um, and then you have someone like Nick Patterson, who you mentioned.
Yeah.
I'm pretty friendly with Nick, and I guess like the thing that I would ask is, like, what was your sense in terms of why someone like Nick Patterson, who his background is a cartographer, PhD in math, then he decided to become a medical geneticist, and now he's, well, whatever this is, paleogenetic stuff. What was your sense of what their attitude to these questions that they're exploring is? I mean, they are, pretty, abstruse, analytical, theoretical genetics types, right? But, then they stumble on this sort of question, which is quite different.
I mean, in many cases, yeah, you're right. I would say I would categorize Nick a little differently. I mean, you know him, I don't know him, though I have spoken to him. He's really an exceptional individual, though, really an unusual person, I think. I mean, my sense from talking to him and reading about him was that he had sort of come out of retirement in order to, come back and address these absolutely fascinating questions. He thought that his skill set was best adapted to biology, which he's described as, having the most interesting problems. Obviously, that's a subjective thing to say, but so I don't think, though he's dealing with maths and statistics, he's the data guy in Reich's lab. I think he's also fascinated in sort of the ancient world, in ancient languages, ancient architecture and religion, and all of those kind of ignited that interest in him. So for him, I think it was a kind of it was an exercise in a way in cryptography, but where the thing he's trying to unlock is the ancient world and ancient tongues. Um, I mean, I think that David Reich is really interesting in this story as well, though I have to say I've never heard him talk about it from this angle, but he is the grandson of Holocaust survivors. And, the Indo-European story has been used and abused in the past. As I said, it's always been political. That's sort of, I think that's the nature of the beast. You're never going to change that. But, famously, the Nazis abused this story and claimed that the Aryans were the original speakers of these languages, and that they kind of lived and breathed in northern Germany and all had blonde hair and blue eyes and made pottery in a uniform way, which is rubbish. But so the communication of the new findings is really important. The way it's communicated, and I think that David Reich is really aware of that, as well as obviously in there at the cutting edge of the research, and that probably shapes his approach to it too.
Yeah, I mean, you probably followed some of the online discourse around these topics. Did you, as you say, there is, this is widely interesting. Half of us speak these Indo-European languages. I think, if you read the book, you can tell that you realized immediately that it was a big deal. And, it's clear in the book it's a big deal. On the other hand, there are certain, shall we say, factions online that have a very political and politicized, of all different stripes. There's Nordicists in Northern Europe. There's out of India people in India. So it runs the gamut across Eurasia, across the Indo-European peoples, I guess, as you could say.
Yeah.
How did you think about that in terms of when you were writing the book? Obviously, this is it's a work of it's a work of science writing, science communication. It's not an ideological book in any way, but there is that looming in the background, as you say, and you allude to it and you write about it sometimes in there. How did you think about it as you were embarking on the project?
I mean, that's a really good question because, this I think there is a tendency when you're doing something like this, which is, it's kind of an unusual exercise because you're essentially trying to do a triangulation between three sciences that don't themselves speak the same language, right? I mean, even the way they define a group identity is different. So, uh, and what I had to keep in my foremind, I think, at the front of my brain was the fact that this is a story about language. So you can get bogged down in all the fascinating genetic detail and the fact that, Yamna carry an R1b variant and Corded R1a and Bill Beaker something else again, R1b. But that is not, although it tells you fascinating things about them, it's not necessarily going to help you track the languages they spoke. It might help, it contributes, and of course that's why it's part of the story, but you can't get bogged down in that stuff. And I think, in the triangulation, in the way that the definitions that the three fields use don't quite map onto each other one to one, there is room for people to represent this story, to misrepresent this story in the ways that they want, and drag them ideologically this way and that. So what I tried to do was to get the balance right, and that's for my readers to decide whether I did that, to keep the linguistics in the forefront, keep my focus on that, uh, but also to kind of, how would I put it, to flag those areas of uncertainty and those areas where there's a bit of a gap between what the three sciences are telling us, and to say, look, here we can't give you hard and fast answers, but nobody can. So anyone telling you that they are sure of what happened here is to be taken with a pinch of salt and be skeptical, because there are people with political agendas who want to fill in those gaps in the story.
Yeah, that's fair enough. Obviously, because of my background, I know the geneticists and the genetics, better. Although, thankfully, there is some methodological overlap, especially I think between historical linguistics and biological, phylogenetics as used in biology. Although there are some arguments about that in terms of how it's being used in linguistics and whether using
Sure.
lexicons is really appropriate and stuff like that. We don't do the technical details of that, but I do want to ask, how difficult was it, as a writer, uh, for you to integrate three different fields with three different traditions, and then, obviously, archaeology and historical linguistics in particular, they're very, very old fields, whereas paleogenomics is a teenager, like a literal teenager, So,
Totally. Yeah.
how was that? What was your experience?
And also, I think, that the paleogenetics, everybody's so excited about it. It's so completely the star of the whole thing. And, uh, steals the oxygen, steals the headlines week by week. So you have to watch out for that. Linguistics, linguists having studied the story for much longer. I think the first thing to say is that, some of what we're learning about prehistoric migration from the ancient DNA people is really in a very important way confirming what linguists have said for hundreds or tens of hundreds of years. So, lots of those branchings that they show in their family trees of languages, which I should say right up front are, simplifications, because languages don't change just by descent. They also change by borrowing and horizontal processes. But those models that they have very often are mapping quite closely onto our understanding about how those ancient speakers moved across the old world. So, that there is quite a lot of exciting agreement there. But again, we're talking about definitions. So, I mean, I know that there's a debate going on at the moment, like, archaeologists dig up a bone, they label it according to the culture which they think they belong to. And then they hand it over to the geneticists, who say, well, actually, genetically, this is not similar, or this is similar to other bones that you have assigned. assigned to that same culture. So then the problem becomes, well, why? Who has the right to label those bones? Obviously the archaeologists get their hands on them first, but what is the definition of a group in prehistory and the identity of a group in prehistory when an archaeologist defines it by the assemblage of objects that comes with it, for example, in a grave, when a geneticist sees continuity or the lack of it in genes, which can be a different dynamic, and language again, which we don't even have any record of in prehistory, but which has its own internal problems because of when does one language stop being the same language and become a new language, since we know that languages evolve all the time. So what is linguistic identity? What is cultural identity? What is genetic identity, and how do they relate to each other? Do they even relate to each other? Because they don't need to necessarily. I mean, I read about this in my introduction. We all have multiple identities, and each one of those is only a part of the fuller picture.
Yeah, actually, I'm gonna jump ahead. I mean, obviously we have a general outline, believe it or not, listener, but I do want to ask, talk about Albanian because you wrote about Albanian. It's fresh in my mind. I wrote about it recently, but I didn't really get into the linguistics is not my thing, so
Hmm.
I didn't really get into it in detail. But can you talk about the Albanian language and in terms of how it's been influenced, and you know how do people know that it's so distinct? Because Albanian, and we'll talk about this more, is a very distinct branch of the Indo-European family. How do they know that, as opposed to all the influences that you read about in the book?
Yeah, so Albanian, an Indo-European language spoken in a mountainous part of the Balkans in Southeast Europe. Probably the mountains are a major part of its story. As with Basque, it's been a kind of protective environment, and probably one of the reasons that language has survived. But not detected or identified as Indo-European until quite late, sometimes called the stepchild of the family for that reason, and subject to many influences from quite an early date. As the Romans started expanding east, crossed the Adriatic, and moved into those parts of Europe, they brought their language, and their language was, of course, another Indo-European language. So the task for historical linguists was to sort of tease apart the influences of those other Indo-European languages that had crossed the Albanian territory from a very early date from what was, if you like, authentically, originally Albanian. But anyway, they did do that, and they worked out, that it was Indo-European, but it had a different backstory. Today, it is considered to belong to a sort of subfamily of Indo-European languages, and in that group are also Greek and Armenian, which of course is not in the Balkans, but does seem to be related to them, and a dead language called Phrygian, which was once spoken on the Anatolian peninsula. So this is an example of one of the ongoing debates. How are these languages related to each other? I wouldn't say there's any hard and fast answers. The genetics is helping because it's showing how the Yamnaya, or direct descendants of the Yamnaya, as they came west into Europe, one group seems to have peeled off south from the Danube corridor and headed for the Balkans. And surprisingly, quite soon seem to have headed up into the mountains, which wasn't their natural environment. So that could be one way that the Albanian language got to where it was, and that another wave of immigration, Yamnaya or Yamnaya related, brought Greek to the southern part of that peninsula, Balkan Peninsula. But there are other theories out there. It's if I had to sort of distill them, they come down to which way around the Black Sea did these languages travel from this supposed homeland on the steppes north of that sea, and did they all go the same way and sort of peel off one after the other, or did they take different routes? At the moment, the thinking is that I suppose, I mean, there's no agreement, but let's say probably the theory nosing ahead of the others is that a precursor of Armenian headed down south through the Caucasus round about 2500 BC, and that the other languages went the other way, and that explains their similarity, because they came from roughly the same place at roughly the same time. There are also similarities with the Indo-Iranian branch, which might suggest that they were all in the same neighborhood up there on the steppe for a while. But these are all open questions, and again, the with a lot of head scratching, the linguists, the geneticists, and the archaeologists are trying to reconcile their different visions of those events.
Yeah, and we're talking a little bit of historical linguists. What was your general sense from archaeologists? Like, I will tell you, I feel like archaeologists are a little. Actually, you could disagree here, but I feel like a lot of the archaeologists I talk to or like have encountered are somewhat polarized when it comes to paleogenomics. Some of them are very gung ho. Obviously, if you look at David Reich's, or S.K. Willer's, if you look at their publications, these paleogenomics people, very rarely is it just a bunch of geneticists anymore. Usually, there are archaeologists on the paper, and if you look at the supplements, the archaeological supplements can go to like 200 to 300 pages. In
Yeah,
terms of
yeah,
because archaeologists they like to describe things in detail. So
yeah.
that's a thing, and they just like obviously can't put it in the original in the paper part of it because that's going to be like 10 pages max or whatever. But they'll put it, and who's doing that because there's an author list. But then there are other archaeologists who sometimes you see it surface in the literature. We're very skeptical of some of these insights uh, you know, from paleogenomics. So, tell me about that in your experience.
I mean, I think that they're still hammering out how to speak to each other, how to. I mean, it's the age old question, isn't it? Really, how to provide context without providing bias in a way. I mean, if you think about the fact, and I'm maybe you were going to ask about this separately, but let me jump ahead and please interrupt if you feel the need. But 10 years ago, when the Copenhagen and was it Copenhagen? Yeah, and Reich groups showed in two papers that came out at roughly the same time that there had been this massive immigration into Europe about 5,000 years ago. The initial interpretation of that, or I mean, I would say, the initial thinking that people jumped to was that was violent, that you don't get a 90% turnover in the gene pool and a complete replacement of the Y chromosomes if it isn't violent. But that changing that interpretation has changed, and I think Christian Christensen has talked to you about this quite dramatically over just the last 10 years. And I suppose the main thing that people have realized, at least this is how I uh, conceived of it and how I wrote about it in my book, is that, even a small sort of spacing of time, small from this perspective, several generations, introduces the possibility that many other mechanisms could have been at work, right? So if you're talking about a turnover in the gene pool that took 16 generations rather than 6, then it needn't have been violent at all. You could imagine a sort of small trickling into an area of a relatively small influx of immigrants, and gradually beginning to trade with the locals, intermarrying with them eventually, but this taking a very, very long time in the context of human lives. And if on top of that, an epidemic has preceded you and wiped out the indigenous inhabitants of that area, then of course it will be easier for you to have an impact on the local gene pool and on the local languages. So all of these other things, and plus the social institutions and conventions that those immigrants brought with them that may have eased the passage of the languages, though not necessarily of the genes, maybe also the genes, but the two things could have traveled separately. All of these things are now in the mix. And I would even say that through these dialogues, through these conversations between the archaeologists and the linguists and the geneticists, the consensus is probably now that those social mechanisms were by far the most important when it came to the spread of the Indo-European languages.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of I mean, this is one of those things where a geneticist, and I think this has changed to be fair. But like a decade ago, I mean, I know a little bit because they actually talked to some of these people. Is geneticists are finding these awesome new results with these awesome new techniques, and it's like kind of welter of data. And then you need to have a discussion section, and you got to write about why do we see these patterns? I mean, I get you can like put the results in the results section, and you have a methods section that's all pre-written. You get to Nature and Science because it's an awesome, like, incredible result. But then there's obviously discussion has to be about like, okay, why this happened, and you could tell in some of the discussion that it was almost an afterthought. And so that's why I think, it was really, really useful to bring archaeologists who think about the process and the mechanism,
Yeah.
how some of these demographic patterns can occur into the mix. So pivoting back to, I think it's to some extent pivoting back to linguistics, could you talk really quickly, reconstructing Proto-Indo-European? How do people do it? This is not something new. This is an old technique, a lot of it. But can you talk about how like paleogenetics and these reconstruction or I think like
Historical linguistics.
I think they call it linguistic paleogenetics as well, although it's a little confusing because linguistic paleontology, I think that's what they call it.
Yeah.
It's a weird term, but can you talk about how they reconstruct Proto-Indo-European, which obviously we have no writing from. It's dated, it probably existed like 4000 BC or something like that. So obviously we don't have any writing for it. And nobody speaks Proto-Indo-European. Sorry, Lithuanians. Can you talk about how they figure that out?
Yeah. Okay. So, right. The challenge, just to put that back at the front of people's minds, is to explain why, for example, the English word daughter had a counterpart that sounded very similar in ancient Greek, dugata, another one in Persian, dochter, Armenian duster, and so all across this Indo-European speaking space. And I'm talking about the ancient world because it goes even further today. You've got people speaking languages where there are too many similarities between them, not only in vocabulary, but also in sound and grammar, to be explained by chance. So that was always the challenge. The philologists and the historical linguists were the first to tackle it on the basis of the languages themselves. The point being that languages never stand still. They're always evolving. So in a way, they're building upon themselves, and you can kind of mine them for their own histories. So, and the other thing to understand is that, and David Anthony wrote about this really well in his book, The Horse, the Wheel and Language in 2007, is to understand that languages change to some extent in predictable ways. So, the classic example is the Kenton to Satum switch, a hard consonant at the beginning of a word before certain vowels is more likely to change to a soft one or a sibilant like S than the other way around. If you've got an M before a T, that's more likely to shift to an NT because both N and T are articulated on the palate than the other way around. So you get this process of assimilation, right? It sort of moves to what's easier for the vocal apparatus over time. So that gave rise to these kinds of sound laws, which describe the regular changes that languages go through over time that you can predict. That meant that we could decide, the historical linguists could start to tease out the components of languages that were related to each other by descent as opposed to borrowing, because languages always, as I say, are influenced by each other horizontally. And so they had a sort of framework. It's called the comparative method. The data that they're looking at is not only the living Indo-European languages. They're not just comparing the ones that we're speaking today. They also have They also have text for historical Indo-European languages that are no longer alive, but we know existed and were once spoken because they were written down. So into that category would come Hittite, for example, is the oldest one we have. Then Sanskrit, ancient Greek, Latin, and all of those we have records for. So that gives you the kind of the time dimension. You can see how these languages have changed over time as well. They do not change at a regular rate, and that's why once you've constructed your basic family tree, when you think that these languages came before these other ones, or which came first, which was the parent, which was the daughter, how close are they? Then if you want to map that onto actual chronological time, if you want to say where these languages lived and died, where they split in terms of, actual real world historical events, you have to calibrate those trees. And you can do that in part with glimpses we get from historical records. So one example I gave in the book was that Hadrian, the future Roman emperor, when he addressed the Senate around 100 AD or CE, he was mocked by the other senators for his Spanish accent. He was born in what is now Seville. But he was still speaking recognizable Latin. So that's a clue that Latin had not yet split into the Romance languages, but we know it had split from other historical clues by the 9th century, for example. So so that's one way of calibrating. And when the historical texts run out, going backwards, because obviously writing was only invented about 5,000 years ago, then you have to turn to archaeology and genetics to try and get a sense of, what the human dramas were that were shaping the world and shaping the languages that people speak. So there are other ways you can calibrate those trees even before we have historical texts to draw upon.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So one of the things you went over the various branches. Well, let's talk about Anatolia really quickly before we go into the details on Italic and Germanic, Balto-Slavic, Indo-Iranian, all of those. Let's talk about Anatolian. Anatolia, Asia Minor. It is today mostly the Republic of Turkey. This looms large in the story over the past couple of centuries, arguably, definitely the last century of the origins of Indo-Europeans. It is the site of possibly, I mean, it depends on who you talk to, of one of the oldest Indo-European languages, the languages spoken by the Hittites, and it's also possibly, I think the German term is Urheimat, the original homeland of the Indo-Europeans. It's been a candidate. The late I think Oxford archaeologist Colin Renfrew proposed that, and there are still others who are supporting the Anatolian / Iranian kind of upland hypothesis even today. There was a paper, it was 3 years ago, Haggerty et al., using some linguistic phylogenetic methods that kind of leaned away from a step thesis more towards maybe a Southern Anatolian hypothesis. Talk about first whether Hittite is Indo-European or not, in your opinion, or the scholar's opinion, I guess, where we are today, and this Anatolian versus steppe dichotomy, like
Yeah,
where we are today,
sure.
Talk about the non-controversial stuff, basically.
I was just about to say that the Anatolian languages, in a way, draw the fire. They're some of they're where much of the controversy is focused at the moment, I would say. I mean, in a way, they always were. So until a few decades ago, there were these two remaining, if you like, rival theories that were really the only two left on the table for the origins of the Indo-European languages, which were the steppe hypothesis, which we've discussed, and the Anatolian hypothesis put forward by Colin Renfrew, the late Colin Renfrew, which put that origin several thousand years earlier, basically saying that the languages expanded out of Anatolia with the first farmers after the so-called farming revolution. And I think, yes, as you say, there are people who still support that. And, there may always be, because we always come back to this problem of just because people move doesn't mean their languages did or didn't, and it's that one-to-one thing which is always going to escape us to some extent, at least prior to writing. So, yeah, and I also should say that there's a problem of nomenclature because of the troubled position of Anatolian in this family tree. The kind of convention that I adopted in my book, for various technical reasons, and just to try and make life easier for readers, was that I reserved the term proto-Indo-European for the parent of all living Indo-European languages. Okay, so there are earlier phases to this family, and that's what's being discussed very heatedly at the moment. If I had to distill it, I would put it this way, which is that there is a linguistic connection between the Anatolian languages and the other Indo-European languages, which was discovered early in the 20th century, the middle of the First World War, in fact, by a Czech linguist called Bedřich Hrozný. And ever since then, we've been trying to explain this connection, and people, archaeologists and geneticists, have essentially failed to find a sort of physical connection that would mirror that linguistic one. For a long time, it was thought that the Anatolian languages, which includes Hittite, the language of the great Hittite empire of the Bronze Age, which was the first Indo-European language to be written down, they were thought to be the eldest daughter of the Indo-European ancestor, the parent. So the first sort of branch to split off from that trunk of the family tree. But I think that what the genetics has done is to sort of change our thinking about that. It's actually not a new idea, what I'm about to say. It's an old idea that's been revived by the genetics. But that Proto-Indo-European, in my terminology, is the sister language to the Anatolian proto-language, to that branch, and that they were both the offspring, if you like, of an older language, which in my book I just referred to as a lingua obscura because we know so little about it, that was spoken earlier than my pi in somewhere in the Caucasus region at the beginning of metalwork, basically, probably around somewhere around 8,000 years ago. The Reich group most recently placed it in the southern Russian steppe. The group at
like the Volga, in the Volga steppe, as
in the
opposed to like
Volga steppe, yeah.
more the Western Pontic steppe.
Yeah, and the Leipzig group places it south of the Caucasus in the Armenian highlands. But I think if you looked at this story over the last few decades, you'd see that they're kind of converging on a narrative where there's a common ancestor that precedes the one that came to Europe from the steppe about 5,000 years ago. There's an earlier layer, if you like, and there was a parent that was spoken then. That's from which one group split off, went to Anatolia, taking the Anatolian languages. The other went up onto the steppe, taking what I call PIE, pi. So, and of course, again, we come back to the problem of definitions, because in one sense, you can keep going back and back. I mean, no language emerges de novo. You could eventually trace them all back more or less to the first languages that humans spoke. But in terms of the kind of recognized definition of what the Indo-European family consists of, and with still great doses of uncertainty in the story, I'd say that's where we are now.
Yeah. I mean, it's within like the last 6 months, there's been, the Reich Lab came out with the paper, and
Yeah.
I know that. Well, I mean, I don't know. I mean,
That paper's in my book, by the way.
yes. I was like, okay, like this is printed to the last second, right? But that's what you got to do in this field.
Yeah, sure.
I used to what's it? Yeah, Adam Rutherford, and I would make jokes because years ago he wrote some book, about like the short history of humankind or something like that, and I would make up like a result as he was like finishing up the book, and I would freak him out because he's like, "Oh crap! Now I gotta like go rewrite those chapters," and I'm like, "Psych!" And he was like,
Yeah.
he's like, "Mate, that's not funny. Like you don't understand." Which
Yeah,
is like,
just
on the one hand, more science is good, but like at some point you got to finish the book and get it out.
you got to get it out, and you've just got to never claim that you've written the definitive story. Nobody's ever written the definitive story.
Yeah. So, I mean, in terms of definitive, for you, is the Indo-European homeland argument finished? Probably finished. Is there a consensus? Is there not a consensus? I mean, how are you feeling after writing the book and reading all the literature and talking to some people?
Yeah. I think it will never be finished, but I think that what has been happening, like now that we've kind of got this broad narrative that, there may have been that earlier phase, which I just discussed, but essentially, the massive radiation of the Indo-European languages happened about 5,000 years ago with those steppe nomads on the steppe north of the Black and Caspian Sea, starting with the Yamnaya, moving east and west and taking their languages with them. That was the major event in the formation and in the success, if you want to put it that way, of this family. So there are other bits that need filling out. There are certainly controversies that need to be resolved. The whole Indo-Iranian branch is another kettle of fish. But I think from my perspective, and maybe some people would disagree with this, but it feels to me like we're filling in gaps within a framework that is now fairly steady, fairly stable. Like, I don't think there's going to be massive major changes, perhaps in that earlier phase. But I think that there is a consensus emerging. And though there's just tons of detail, especially when you come to the sort of later branchings of the tree, there's tons of detail that still needs to be clarified and filled in and may never be. So that's what I feel. But I would just add the caveat that there is I'd say a minority, but still quite a respected minority of experts who've worked in this field who think it's all a load of rubbish, really. I mean, Jean-Paul Demoule, I don't know if you've had him on your show. You definitely should if you haven't. French archaeologist who just recently brought out his own book or his own updated book about the Indo-Europeans. He thinks that we're chasing a mirage, and that what happened at the Enlightenment was essentially that we replaced a biblical notion of a homeland with a nationalistic one. And I think there's something to be said for that, in the sense that what was a language in prehistory? Was it rather a chain of dialects? Does the tree model even really adequately fit what we're talking about at that time in that period? And if there isn't a single route to the tree, then is there a single homeland? I think he's right to keep us asking that fundamental question. I think most people would disagree with him and would say it's reasonable to say that real people spoke a real language in a real place that gave rise to the Indo-European languages that we know of. But I think you have to keep in mind that there are other ways of thinking about this whole thing.
Yeah. Let's we've been talking for a while, so let's pivot to the concrete, the real people, the peoples, I guess in the plural. So we're talking about the Indo-Europeans, the proto-Indo-Europeans. I think these are the Yamnaya, the Pitgrave people, coming out of the Pontic steppe. They're nomads. I think that the listener will have a general sense of who they are, but let's talk about some of the other populations. Like, talk about the corded ware. Who are the corded ware people, and how are they related to the Yamnaya, as far as we know now?
Yeah. So one of the reasons that whole scenario about a violent invasion has been sort of thrown out is that archaeologists don't see the Yamnaya going as far as they would have had to have caused that huge turnover in the gene pool. They only went as far as what is now Hungary, basically the Carpathian Basin and the western end of the steppe, if we're talking about the European story, because they also went east. But but what happens is that they expand. We're still talking about 5,000 years ago, and then this new culture, I should say, arises in the far east of Europe, between sort of Bohemia, the Czech Republic, and modern Ukraine. And archaeologists call them corded ware because of the way they made pottery by pressing string into wet clay. And the question long has been, and still is, what was the relationship between them and the Yamnaya? We know that they raced across the top of Europe, and they're kind of associated with the birth of the Germanic languages, or the set of dialects that would eventually give rise to the Germanic languages. And their crossing of Europe probably was quite violent. I think that's the consensus today. But what was the relationship? Were the Yamnaya violent? That's much muddier. Although I think genetics is illuminating that as well. So I think, you know a lot about this too. So my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that one theory holds that they were direct descendants of the Yamnaya. Another theory holds that they were sort of two related clans who split from each other in way back in the steppe, and then took two different paths west. And the reason that's important is from the linguistic point of view, because obviously it has an impact on how close the languages were that they spoke. Not that we can tell terribly much about that, because again, all this is happening before writing. And the reason that the way that genetics has contributed is in showing some very recent studies that at least some people of the corded ware culture were direct descendants of the Yamnaya. But neither culture is completely visible to us. And there is an idea that those kurgans, those burial mounds we see in both cases, are just the elite who are being buried there, and we don't see the sort of the masses who might have had a different relationship and a different role in society, and move differently. So there is a lot of uncertainty around that. Have I answered your question? I can't remember what else you asked.
I think what you implied there, kind of said, is it seems the most likely I think from paleogenetics, the most likely conclusion is that the corded ware are probably a daughter culture of the Yamnaya pretty directly and recently. And
Yeah.
I think, what you're alluding to is there is literature where it's quite clear. I think, and I think I'm quoting Nick here, because he knows all the details of this sort of stuff, but it's like there are Yamnaya in Kurgan burials that look to be like recent ancestors, like grandparents, great grandparents, or something of some corded ware individual,
Yeah.
as opposed to the reverse. So that is indicative of a parent-child relationship
Yeah.
between the two populations, right? And
Right.
so that's that's notable. Now, we are
Just on that,
I think
Razib,
yeah,
I just wanted to
yeah,
say that so the thinking there would be that as the Yamnaya moved west, they kind of hooked up with the women of the indigenous cultures, the farming women there, and the corded ware were the offspring of those unions. So the corded ware, I think, are about share about three quarters of their autosomal DNA with the Yamnaya, but they don't have the same Y chromosome variant. So
yeah. Yeah, the Y chromosome stuff is always I mean, you know what? Like that never ends. You allude to the Y chromosome stuff in the book, but probably for the
yeah,
best that you don't get into the weeds on that because
yeah,
men and their paternal lineages is a never-ending argument. Maybe we could say.
yeah. The
Uh,
touchy point. Exactly.
who you think my daddy is, But anyway, okay, so we're a little we're running up against time a little bit, so I'm gonna just like jump to just a couple topics I want to talk about. There's I just do want to say to the listener, by the time this is out, your book will be almost out. I think in the States. I think as we're
13th
recording,
of
it is
May.
out.
Yeah,
Yeah,
out
and
in the
that's
UK, 13th of May.
it's already out in the UK. So, if you listen to this sort of content, which I do write about, and podcast with people, I think Proto is an excellent, excellent book to get up to speed where we are in 2025. And there have been books that have come out earlier, like David Reich's book. Obviously, it's a great book. I recommend it to everybody, but he wrote it in 2018, and that is in the paleogenomic. That is like an epoch ago. That is like it's in the Mesozoic of the
It's 2007 his last book, The Horse, the Wheel and Language, 2007.
Yeah, that's David Anthony. David
Oh,
Anthony.
sorry.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. I mean, Anthony. I mean, I do have to say, I do recommend people always still read that book. I'm sure
Yeah,
you've read it.
totally.
There's so much good material in there. Now, it turned out, as
Absolutely.
David would say, he definitely like could have gone bigger in his idea of like demographic migration. It was a very, very
Mm.
subtle thing that he was modeling, although at the time that he wrote it, that was still very bold, within the field of archaeology, right? So,
Oh, yeah,
everything
yeah,
has its
yeah,
own
yeah.
time. Yeah, so I
Yeah, I mean,
definitely
that's
would
been
recommend.
that's been the main revolution,
Yeah,
right? The last 10 years, the extent to which migration has shaped us.
yeah, yeah. That's true. And I think one thing people always have to remember is like, you know, this is an empirical question to some extent because you never know. As we're recording, a paper came out in Nature, um, you know, that showed that basically the the Punic cultures of the Western Mediterranean, which is like the Phoenician descendant cultures of the Western Mediterranean, are actually genetically mostly indigenous, in terms of they don't have very much, if at all, Levantine ancestry.
Mm.
So, the Phoenician expansion was actually a matter of culture rather than genes, which, has surprised some people. Although if you read some of the Greek, I mean, because we don't have, unfortunately, for various reasons, we don't have too much of the records of the Phoenicians themselves. Well, thank Cato, I think Cato the Elder, why we don't have Carthaginian records, honestly. But setting that aside, the Greeks, record a lot of stuff about them because they encountered them for centuries. The Romans didn't actually encounter them as much as long, and a lot of the Phoenicians were of mixed background. The Greeks knew, like the Greeks knew like Hannibal's family. There were Greek people that had married into the Hannibal, the famous Hannibal. But unfortunately, it's a little complicated because all of his male ancestors seem to be called Hannibal or Hamilcar. They like have like three names, so it makes it really difficult. But in any case, so that wasn't too surprising. But let's jump to let's jump real quickly. Yeah, go
Yeah.
on,
I mean,
Laura.
I was just gonna say that, that illustrates brilliantly how variable, what different forms migration can take. All through the 20th century, we argued about whether the farmers after the Neolithic Revolution, whether they moved themselves or whether their techniques just moved. And in fact, it was them, massive but slow migration. And then in my chapter on Tocharian, which is considered the second oldest daughter of Proto-Indo-European, the one that went really far east to what is now China and died out long ago, that was a much faster migration, probably with just a small group of people who literally crossed the entire length of the steppe in probably, David Anthony has suggested 2 years, one overwintering one winter in the middle, but as little as 2 years. Others would say closer to a generation or maybe even a couple of generations, but still massively fast given that they only had wagons at the time. So yeah, that's another thing that's come out of the last 10 years in the ADNA revolution, is just how variable migration can be.
Yeah, it is variable. So it's I guess what I would say, check your preconceptions at the door sometimes, because you never know what you're going to find,
Right.
which is
Exactly.
exciting. And if you're not a very, very ideological person, there's no problem with it. It's just like some people who have some ideological preconceptions, whichever direction it goes, you know, they have to just like accept that, it might not land their way, whatever that means. Let me ask you about okay, like as we're pressed for time, so I want to ask you about like one specific, because you have all these narratives in your book, and that kind of like follow the various Indo-European peoples. As we said, half of the people in the world. Can you talk about the Balto-Slavic and Indo-Iranians? Because
Yeah.
these 3 or 2 groups, depending on how you want to count them, or maybe 4 groups, I guess, but really Indo-Iranian is so close that most people just
Yeah.
they don't count them as separate. Talk about how they're related to each other, and their migration of kind of out of the eastern quarter where in your telling.
Yeah, I think this is so fascinating. So, in terms of concrete people, we kind of left it with the corded ware coming into Europe, and then Europe has its own story. But around 2200 BCE, we know there was a major climate event that actually affected the whole planet. But in Europe, or at least in parts of Europe, the parts where the corded ware people and their descendants were, it resulted in a severe drought. So what happens essentially is you get this turning around and a great big migration going back east towards the steppe. And again, we don't have time to go into all the details, but if you bring together the linguistics, the archaeology, and genetics, and by the way, I do go into detail in my book. The essential story is that the kind of front, the avant-garde of that wave, they end up in the kind of rain shadow of the Ural Mountains, and that gives rise to the culture we call Syntashta, the inventors of the chariot, and many would say the most probable speakers of Proto-Indo-Iranian. But you have to think of that migration. Again, it was a slow one over generation, maybe taking 600 years or so in all. But you've got this whole chain of people going all the way back to sort of the Dnieper Basin in what's now Ukraine. And further back in that chain, there are people speaking other languages that at some point would have been mutually intelligible, but then went off and did their own thing. And the linguists, I suppose it's still not a consensual theory yet, but it does explain a lot of things. So one idea is that further back in that chain were the Proto-Baltic speakers, and that this explains many curious and otherwise unexplained similarities between, for example, Latvian and Lithuanian, the living Baltic languages, and the descendants of, say, Sanskrit and Old Persian. And that right at the back of that chain, so to speak, its starting point on the Middle Dnieper, what was left behind in linguistic terms was Proto-Slavic. And Proto-Slavic, the speakers of Proto-Slavic, then kind of expanded up the Dnieper and moved sort of westish towards what is now Poland and the Slavic-speaking lands. So that is the theory. It is controversial, but it's pretty fascinating if you ask me.
Yeah, I think this was it spring of 2021? I was talking to Thomas Olander, who you probably know of,
I heard that
Indo-Europeanist from
interview.
Denmark.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And I pointed out to him, because the thing that historical genetics people always notice is, I don't want to get too deep into it. R1A, the frequency of R1A in South Asia is like, 20-25%, around 50% Eastern Europe. There's 2 branches. There's a quote Asian branch, which, obviously, as you note in the book, where does the word Dnieper and Don come from?
Mm.
Probably Indo-Iranian words, actually. So,
Mm.
but anyway, there was an Asian branch, usually identified with the Z93 mutation, and there's a European branch, quote unquote, which is generally found in the Slavs. I think it's like 283 or something, Z283. Anyway, something like that. When you look at those two branches, though, their mutation is separated. It's like 3,500 BC, which is right on the eve of the Indo-European expansion. I pointed out to him it's a little interesting that the Balto-Slavic people have R1A, Indo-Iranians have R1A, whereas the Italic and the Celtic people have R1B. Which now we have this work out of I think Chris Johnson and Whiskey Ellerslie, their recent work about like looking at which Indo-European populations contribute to what. It looks like that branch of R1. There's a branch of R1B that's associated with bell beakers.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's a branch of R1A associated with corded ware. There's another branch of R1B associated with Yamnaya. These seem to be like paternal lineage cultures, and certain ruling populations or something. Were just very common in them.
Yeah, it's very, very intriguing. It's very alluring. And as I said, often there is this mapping of the prehistoric migrations onto the split of the languages. But again, we have to come back to the fact that the story I'm telling is about language and not genetics. Genetics is sort of a supporting role here. And there are plenty of examples also of where people spread and didn't take their languages, or where languages spread and didn't take their speakers with them, so to speak. Celtic arrived in Ireland, but there was barely a tremor in the gene pool. So, you just have to be aware that I'm telling the story here of languages, not of genes. And it's great when they illuminate the language story, but you just have to be aware. And, as you say, leave your prejudices and your excitement basically at the door.
All right. Well, so obviously people should check out the book Proto. Link is going to be in the show notes, etc. I mean, it's not hard to find, but I want to ask you, like, as kind of like the closing question as we're heading out here. What was the most surprising thing you learned while you were writing this book?
Oh, so many things, so many things. I mean, okay, in a broad brush way, that would be just this idea of migration and how constant it's been in the human story, and how, it's embedded there in the languages we speak today. So that's one thing. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about that anyway from a non-linguistic point of view over the last decade or so, hasn't it? I mean, you've talked about it a lot yourself. But in a narrower way, the thing that really charmed me and enthralled me, I suppose, was just the way that these languages and the stories that were told in them, because stories are a huge part of this story, were handed down over vast tracts of time, even before they were written down. There are stories we're still telling today about dragons and dragon slayers, about smiths with magic powers that are thousands and thousands of years old, probably, because you can use this comparative method that the linguists use also on mythological units, on myths. So that's what they're beginning to conclude. So I find that extraordinary. Writing was this amazing invention, but we were able to hold on to things and pass them down over very long periods of time, even before writing came along.
Yeah. I mean, some people, my friend Antonio Martinez Garcia, or Garcia Martinez, I always get the last name confused. But he said, we're entering a new age of orality, oral, that's a totally different topic. I think Zoomers do not read. It's pretty obvious. I have breakdowns of who listens to the podcast and who reads the essays by age, and there are certain patterns, which like you could guess what the patterns are. But there was an earlier age of orality. And it was actually a big deal relatively late in history. As you might know, the Quran is termed the recitation. The Vedas were oral for thousands of years, and
Yep.
the Buddhist scriptures, it's I think was it like Ananda, his cousin, recited everything the Buddha had said, and he said, "Thus I have heard." And so a lot of it is just like the singing, the recitation, and the orality, which I think is also laced throughout. It's a theme throughout your book, but I think it's a
Totally.
theme throughout the book because you cannot avoid how important the oral medium was to these people. And I think the two double faced aspects of that is oral languages can be quite protean with pidgins and dialects and whatnot, but also once it becomes some sort of sacred ritualistic medium, it can be incredibly fixed, and like give us some deep insights into the past, right?
Absolutely. So when I said, that it's thought that it was predominantly social mechanisms that spread the languages brought by those nomads. I mean, storytelling was one way that they managed to maintain social connections between themselves because they were nomads, right? So they spread out and they were apart, great distances apart for long periods of time when they were moving with their herds. And storytelling was an important way of reinforcing bolstering their identity. They were also, hospitality was an important part of it. Booze, as I write in the book, intoxicating substances, that all of that went together as a package that maintained social identity and that, as a sort of byproduct, because I presume it wasn't their intention, helped spread their languages through the old world.
Yeah, totally, totally. So yeah, it's been great talking to you, Laura. Great book. I enjoyed it. It was an enjoyable read. Very, very fact filled. A lot of the stuff I knew, but there was stuff in there that I didn't know. I actually had like a list of questions. I think we got through like maybe half of them. So
Well,
there's
happy to come back. Happy to come back another time.
yeah, for
Part
sure, for
two.
sure. Yeah. So enjoy your Paris spring, and I will see you online.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot for the invitation. Great questions. Bye, Razib.
This podcast for kids. This is my favorite part.